So in this video, we're going to look at the book of Ezra. So originally, Ezra and Nehemiah were one book, but in our English Bibles, we find that it is two books. So we're going to treat this as one book as it falls in our English Bible and only look at Ezra. And in another video, we will look at Nehemiah. Okay, so let's jump in and answer our 8 questions about the book of Ezra. So the first one is, who wrote the book of Ezra? Most people think that it was Ezra himself because a lot of the book is in first person. So that tends to make people believe that he's the one that penned it. Who was it written to? It was written to the remnant of Jews that came back after the 70 years of Babylon captivity. Now let's answer the question of how much time is covered. So chapters 1 through 6 cover about 23 years, and then chapters 7 through 10 cover about 60 years. Now in that first 23 years, it's focused on Zerubbabel rebuilding the temple, and then the 60 years kind of focuses on Ezra rebuilding them spiritually, teaching them the law and explaining scripture to them. So the main idea in the book of Ezra is it's the account of the return of the Jewish exiles from Babylon to Jerusalem. And we read of the reestablishment of the temple. So remember when we left off with 2 Chronicles, the temple had been destroyed and the Jews were taken into exile into Babylon. So 70 years passed. They were in captivity for 70 years, and then they were allowed to return home. But since they had destroyed the city and burned the temple, there was work to do. And also it recounts them reestablishing temple worship. So I want to do a really quick world history lesson right here because I think this is important to help us understand maybe some things that we hear thrown around sometimes. You may hear about a lost tribe, speaking of the 12 tribes of Israel. But I want to submit this to you, a world history lesson. Okay, so the 10 northern tribes went into Assyrian captivity around 721, 722 BC, okay? But then Babylon overtook Assyria around 612 BC. So basically, Babylon just kind of swallowed up that whole territory. So those 10 tribes would kind of be underneath the control of Assyria now. Babylon, because Babylon overthrew Assyria. Sorry, I'm probably making this as clear as mud. Anyway, so then Babylon comes and takes the southern tribes captive in 606 BC. That's when they took away the first captives away. And there was 3 more waves of them taking people captive. So all the tribes are under kind of the Babylon's control there. So they all had the opportunity to return when Cyrus gives a decree 70 years later. There were no lost tribes. So just a quick history lesson there. Okay, so now let's think about some notable characters. You have Cyrus, and he's the king of Persia. You have Ezra, and he was a priest and scribe. And Zerubbabel, he was like a governor type thing. You have King Artaxerxes. And then you have the prophets, Haggai, and sometimes he's Haggai, and Zechariah. Now, those are the actual books that are found in our Old Testament that are referred to as minor prophets. But these prophets also play a role in the book of Ezra. And then also Darius, who was king of Persia after Cyrus. So some notable events in the book of Ezra. Cyrus gives a proclamation for the Jews to return back to Jerusalem. That's how the book opens. And in fact, the book opens exactly the way 2 Chronicles closes. So some exiles do return. They rebuild the altar so they can begin to offer burnt offerings to God. Zerubbabel begins to rebuild the temple, but then adversaries oppose the building. So the Jews get discouraged, they get afraid, and they stopped working on the temple. There's some letters back and forth. King Artaxerxes gives a decree to stop working, but then after about 50 years, Darius gives a decree to begin working. And finally, the temple is finished and dedicated, and a Passover is celebrated. So when we think about where on the timeline Ezra takes place, it takes place during that time called the return from captivity. And around 536 BC, so that would be about a little more than 500 years before Jesus is born, that first round of people that had been taken captive returned to Jerusalem. And then around 450 BC, another wave, a second wave group returns. So now let's think about Jesus in the book of Ezra. There are no direct prophecies found in Ezra, but the governor, Zerubbabel, that we talked about earlier, he was in David's seed line through which Jesus, the Messiah, would come into the world. And we can find his name in Matthew 1, chapter 1, verse 12. Also, we see the observance of the Passover. And again, that was just a shadow or a prefigure of Jesus dying on the cross and him shedding his blood as the ultimate lamb that would take away the sin of the world. So let's finish up by thinking about one reason to study Ezra. So I want to read just a small passage from chapter 4 in Ezra, and I'll be reading from the ESV version, and I'm going to start in verse 4. Then the people of the land discouraged the people of Judah and made them afraid to build, and they bribed counselors against them to frustrate their purpose all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, even until the reign of Darius, king of Persia. And in the region of Ahasuerus, in the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. So we can see some things happening here. We can see the people getting discouraged. We see them being afraid. They just stopped the building. There's bribes against them that are trying to frustrate their purposes. We have some written accusations against them. Just a lot of things against them that were making them just kind of give up, just throw up their hands and say, we're done. We're not gonna work on building this temple. So here's where Haggai the prophet comes in, because that book takes place within this chapter, if that makes sense. So he writes some things and he encourages them. And we find in chapter 5, the beginning of chapter 5, it worked. Because they began to rebuild the house of God that is in Jerusalem, and the prophets of God were with them, supporting them. So I think our takeaway point is we have the entirety of Scripture that can encourage us and help us not to be afraid, not to give in to our adversaries, not to become discouraged. Even if people try to frustrate our plans, we just need to be about the Lord's work. So I hope this has been helpful, just kind of a brief overview of the book of Ezra. It's a short book. You could sit down and read it in probably 30 minutes or under, just to kind of learn some more things about it, because like I said, we just hit the high spots. So I hope this has been helpful, and the next video we'll look at Nehemiah.